Hey everyone, welcome back to iPolitics signature podcast, No Talking Points. I'm Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief of iPolitics and one of two co-hosts, along with Brian Storseth, the publisher of iPolitics. I'm joined today with an excellent selection of guests. Two iPolitics mainstays, our terrific Queen's Park reporter, Barbara Patrocinio, and our terrific major projects reporter, Aya Dufour. And of course, from Navigator, we have Bahoz, Dara, Aziz. And thank you everyone for joining us. Like I said, I'm a broken record at this point. Lots to talk about. Different week, but same sort of workload. Let's talk about the big news from the weekend. We're going to have 3 by-elections coming up all on the same day, April 13th, which just happens to be, I think, 2 days after the Liberal Federal Convention wraps up in Montreal. With 3 victories, the Liberals would pass the threshold for a majority, but just that in the House of Commons, setting up a very, very high stakes series of by-elections. Start with you, Brian. Are we overhyping this thing, or is this actually really, really a crucial set of by-elections that would change the dynamic in the House of Commons?
Well, I mean, yeah, it would absolutely change the dynamic in the House of Commons because I believe you'd have to prorogue so that you could reset, but the committee structures would change. Obviously, for the viewers that don't know, the House of Commons the committee structure is based on the number of seats and the percentage of seats each party has in the House of Commons. So with the majority, the government would then be given 50% of the seats in committees, as well as many other advantages that they would get out of it. So theoretically, Parliament would run smoother anytime you're in a majority government.
So I guess the question that I still have, and I still haven't got a good answer about this, is if you get to 172, you still have your speaker who only votes in the case of a tie. I don't know if you have enough votes as a result to make a major overhaul of the committees. I don't know if you need another person or what. There's so much confusion that happens if you just get to that threshold and we have to go to the speaker. But you obviously would know more about the inner workings of Parliament than I think the average Joe. What are your thoughts about how this kind of impacts the state of play in Ottawa?
I think it's going to drastically impact it for multiple reasons. I think the one thing I will say is, regardless of the number, and I think it's going to be great to get to that majority area, I think that Mark Carney could still expect to be attracting a lot of other floor crossers, like at least a couple. So I think that the number will actually just get stronger as time goes on. So to your main point, Marco, when you talk about how important are these 3, important, very important. But I don't think the question for me is if Mark Carney is going to get a majority. The question is when, right? So if in fact Terrebonne doesn't go the way that folks plan, which I do think it's going to end up as a win, but if it doesn't, I think that Mark Carney can expect a majority government down the line. And I think that that's something that he's very committed to and very committed to doing in a very, let's say, collaborative way, talking to folks from other parties. And we're seeing that even with the candidate in Scarborough Southwest. He's bringing somebody up from the Ontario NDP, the deputy leader of the Ontario NDP, and bring her up to be a Liberal. So I think that there's going to be major changes and major impacts to how Parliament functions. I think the bigger question for me is, what does this do for Pierre Poilievre, right? Like, what does this win? What does handing Mark Carney, in my opinion, handing Mark Carney a majority mean for Pierre and the Conservatives?
Do you think it puts off an election until maybe next year or so?
Absolutely. I'm not. Maybe, listen, I moved out of Ottawa a little bit ago. Maybe I'm not in the bubble. Maybe that's why. But I don't feel like there's this looming general election. I think Mark Carney is somebody who is so committed to governing and getting things done. I don't think he's this massive campaigner. Like, I think he's politically savvy and has the retail politician skills, but he's not like Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau was a campaign machine. And in fact, maybe that's where we saw some of the best of him. But I think Mark Carney really loves being in government and really loves putting forward these nation-changing processes and plans and policies that I don't see him wanting to continuously go back and forth to the polls. I see him doing it the exact way that he's been doing it. And I think the reality is if he wanted to go to the polls, well, now is a good time as any, but we haven't done that, right? He could have done that before the by-elections. So I see it with him moving forward and gaining popularity and attracting more Conservatives. And then I see Pierre kind of, and I hate to say this to Conservative fans, but floundering, right? Like, he's just losing popularity. He's losing steam and he's lost his way in terms of messaging, approach. He's kind of all over the place. He's scattered. So I think it'll be interesting for him for sure. And I do think we shouldn't be counting on a general anytime soon.
Yeah, what do you think? I mean, we make this comment in the office a lot that, if you do, to Bahuz's point, if you do go for an election, you're swapping out the trips to Tokyo and Sydney for Saskatoon and Regina, which I think is a fair trade as someone who lived in Regina. I'm joking, of course. But yeah, Aya, what do you think? Do you think the Prime Minister is keen to get back on that election campaign wagon?
I don't see why he would, right? Like, it's going to cost money. It could be an unpopular decision, especially when there's so much going on in the world geopolitically. So why would you when you're so close to a majority? And I agree with what she said there about how, like, it's unavoidable. It's either through this by-election or through another floor crossing. It doesn't seem like there's a million other ways it's going to happen. And I mean, I do think there's a chance Terrebonne will stay bloc. But then again, once you're there, you're so close. It's funny though, because I remember around this time last year, it also felt like unavoidable that Pierre Poilievre was going to win. So you never know.
It's true, right? Yeah, predictions seem to. I feel like we should all get out of the business of doing predictions at this point after what happened last spring. But Barbara, the prime minister, spoke to his best pal, Doug Ford, and Doug Ford loves calling elections. I don't know what influence Doug Ford has on Mark Carney, but I'm sure the advice for him was just let her rip. What are you hearing, Barbara, in Queen's Park about that?
This is crazy. Like, yeah, I think Marco, as you said, like it's not true that they really have like Doug Ford is not a major player regarding Mark Carney decisions. I don't think he do like obviously he loves to say that they are best friends, that they have this super intimate relationship, but it's just not how it really works. I do feel like perhaps we had this. I think it was the Globe had the story about how they were having chats about how having an early election helps to secure like a majority government. So if you are like looking to do that, you might as well call them sooner. But honestly, like it's just a little bit. It's too ridiculous to think that he just listened to advice from Doug Ford. I think he was probably already like had these dates ready for a long time now. And yeah, it was just sort of the time, right? Like, because when Christia left and also Bill Blair, I think he already knew that he would have to do it. Yeah, I don't think that Doug Ford was a major factor in any of these by-elections though.
I think the by-election is, look, you're mandated by law to call a by-election within a certain number of dates. So I think the by-elections are pretty irrelevant, to be honest with you, Marco. I think that at the end of the day, and I don't know a prime minister that's ever cared whether one of his candidates in a riding with 60+% has to campaign for an additional 30 days. As I've said all along, the Liberal Party is going to try their best to create a window in the spring to be able to go to an election if they want to go to an election. I'm hopeful that, as everybody said, that Prime Minister Carney seems to be a pragmatist. He seems to be better as Prime Minister than as campaign leader of the Liberal Party. So I think that now is not the time for an election. But there's a very real possibility that if the polls continue to be where they are, I mean, at the end of the day, Mark Carney is who he is. He's a banker, right? Risk and reward. If the risk is looking like it's, 50-50, I would imagine he takes a few more floor crossers. But I don't know any politician that's going to look at those numbers being sustained and say, no, I don't want 8 seats in Alberta. I mean, it gives you so much more credibility to say you represent the entire country when you actually represent the entire countries. I think it's still out there that there's a very real chance there is an election, but I'm not sure it's the best thing for the country right now.
And, there could be some further, disruptions. As we know, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith said he's going to resign his seat once Doug Ford calls a provincial by-election in Scarborough Southwest. And then, of course, Sandra Boulay-Rees might be leaving for provincial politics, although I think, Aya, you were saying it probably won't happen until that election's called, or maybe until the summer. If we get into this environment where you get to 172, or maybe you add some floor crossers, I'll bring it back to you, Bahoz. Like, do you think that's enough to quell that? Or is it like, to Brian's point, if you got the polls and you're at 15% lead, you talk about how Pierre might be at an absolute, nadir in terms of his popular support. How much of that is going to weigh? Even though Mark Carney may not love it, could you imagine someone whispering in his ear saying, okay, I know you're not a big campaigner, but let's get this done. So 4 or 5 years from now, we basically have 4 to 5 years of runway on this.
I mean, it definitely depends on the political context, right? Like what world we're currently in and what the message that they can put forward is. I remember the 2021 election during COVID, and the question that Trudeau got right after he announced, and the question that he got throughout the entire campaign every single day was, why are we in an election? You guys are fine. Like you have government. You're in a place where you could do this. And the other parties are saying we're willing to be collaborative, we're willing to work with the government. But ultimately they still called an election. And I think whether that took away from votes or not, I'm not entirely sure. But I think the reality is there was a question that they got consistently and were unable to answer. So I think if the context that we were in at the time provides a question and provides an answer, I think that there's more possibility for that election, that general election, to play out. I agree with Brian's point. I think it's always very difficult to say no to very good polls. And I think it's very difficult to say no to a larger majority, especially in areas that the Liberals haven't traditionally held. I get that. But I think, again, like, it doesn't have to go through this path. Like, the thing with politics is, like, I think sometimes people think we're all playing 4D chess and we're like, oh, we know what's going to happen like 2, 3, 4 months down the line. But the reality is, and even with Mark Carney being prime minister now, when I was in government, we didn't think that the Liberals were going to continue on in government prior to his arrival. Things changed so rapidly and so quickly, right? So ultimately, it's not certain what will happen. But for what I'm currently seeing, I see that the path that they're taking in the moment is to obtain more support, obtain a majority government through these more maybe untraditional means, but lower stakes, lower pressure means, and ways that I also think kind of take some good shots at the Conservatives while doing so as well.
And both, Bahoz and Barbara, you guys you got a front row seat at the last, I'll call it snap election with Doug Ford pulling the plug on a majority, saying he needed
Yes.
more. Like, do you think that had an impact at all? Like, I don't think he got the big mandate he was looking for. That being said, he still won pretty comfortably.
No, you're right. And he won a third mandate. That's historical in its own right. That's something to be commended to him and his team and his ability as a retail politician. But like, ultimately, I think he had it wasn't really like the exact same number of seats, which I think were actually 2 seats lower than he had in the last election. And then, we used to joke that he paid, I don't know, however many millions of dollars just to give the Ontario Liberals official party status. So, it didn't really actually play out the way that I think he wanted to. And on election night, I remember saying to CBC, like, I think Doug's probably yelling at somebody in a back room right now who, wanting a bit more than this, right? They wanted to break those bigger numbers, and I don't think they did. Ultimately, it saved them a bit more time, 2 additional years, but I don't think it did exactly what they didn't get this massive super majority that they were originally promised, right? And that's the reality that you take. Sometimes the voters do punish you, or they give you a bit of contempt in having to go to the polls so early. Like, it does happen on occasion, so you just never know.
Yeah,
What do you think about that, Barbara? You think that would that's not part of Doug Ford's maybe super secret advice to Mark Carney? Be like, hey, kind of ignore that. I kind of didn't make many inroads in the last election.
This is actually super interesting because I think we're now a little bit over a year of the provincial election, right? And we are starting to see in the polls, like, obviously Doug Ford always talks about how he wants to be premier forever. Once you keep running, there's no signs that he wants to, like, he's definitely not preparing anyone in his caucus to be the next leader. So he wants to stay on and he wants to keep running, keep pushing for it. But you're starting to see in the polls a very interesting trend right now. Like, the last one, I think it was by Liaison, showed the PCs almost tied with the Liberals, and the Liberals, they don't even have a leader just yet, the Ontario Liberals, right? So it's a little bit of a trend of like people getting sick of having more of the same because there's no really sense of like refreshment. Obviously, he has done some sort of unpopular moves recently with the OZAP cuts and all of that might play a role as well. But yeah, it's very interesting to think that it was just 1 year ago and they were polling so high, and now they are like where they are right now. And we do have like some interesting movements in the premier's office as well. We have Ivana Yelich. She left, I think, a little less than a year ago. She was to the private sector for a little while, and then she just came back now because Travis can move to the director, right? Chief of staff, sorry. And so she's back to the PR, and she's someone who really reigns in the court a little bit with some discipline on it. So I don't know if they're counting on her a little bit to sort of make the premier, just get back on track a little bit in the polls. But yeah, it's interesting to see how they're like, like last election they won. It wasn't the major victory they were hoping for, but they still won. And now they're sort of like leaning down.
I would love to see message discipline Doug Ford. I think that would be very interesting. But I guess one thing I want to talk to you about was
Marco. That would be boring.
Well, I think it would be boring. I just think it would be fascinating to watch him stop mid-sentence and realize he shouldn't go on a tangent.
Yeah, she just looked
like I often do.
You'd have no underpass. You'd have no additions to the island airport.
It's true. And Home Depot might not be open next holiday, so I don't know. Of course, we also have another provincial election on the horizon in Quebec. What do you think the risks are there about calling a federal election before or after this? I know the PQ also has some weird polling numbers. Like, they're clearly in the lead, but it doesn't seem like a very comfortable lead, and it still seems like a lot could happen there. What's the kind of dynamic there, considering all this sovereignty and referendum stuff we've been hearing?
I couldn't tell you. I'm looking at the same polling numbers as you, and I'm not seeing a pattern. And I think there's a lot that could happen. The Liberals We still don't know how well they're going to do in the coming months. There's still lots up in the air. There are like some players that haven't really come into the arena yet. And that's the thing. I feel like we have a distorted view of how well the Parti Québécois is doing because we don't have the full information about who they're going to be up against. And I also think I personally haven't really been hearing this question of sovereignty from friends and family too much lately. It's just been sort of eclipsed by everything else that's happening. It's just not a good timing to talk about the risk of becoming your own country when we're living in a more unstable world than we have in a long time.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I did want to shift gears a bit, talk about the conflict in the Middle East. The Prime Minister last week, or I should say the previous Saturday, put out that statement signaling support for the Americans and the Israelis taking action against Iran. He qualified that quite a bit, if you want to call it that. You call it flip-flop. A few days later saying that decision came with some regret, and he mused that it may have been in violation of international law. I spoke to some Liberal MPs, as the other outlets have, and the sense is some support, some criticism, but generally speaking, a bit of confusion about this and how it aligns with what he said in Davos. Brian, do you think this is really going to be one of these things that really hurts the PMs, even if not electorally, but just on a credibility level, considering he would rushed out to give a thumbs up to Donald Trump's actions, and now it seems to be a bit of a careful backtracking or pivot or clarification, however you want to frame it?
Well, as I said last week, Marco, I think anytime you rush out to support one of President Trump's foreign policy adventures is a mistake. I don't think this is going to have long-term political consequences as the Conservative Party is tripling and quadrupling down on whatever Donald Trump decides to do, which I think is politically dangerous. Yeah, at the end of the day, I think you can, in regards to the decision the Prime Minister made, they were traveling. Does he have a lot of really senior people around him? Yes, but you're in different time zones. I think that the message was maybe bungled a little bit, but I don't think this is something that's going to, as long as it doesn't become a pattern, I don't think this is something that will necessarily hurt Prime Minister Carney a whole lot, especially domestically, his opposition is taking such a path in a different direction than him.
And because what do you make of it? Obviously, this is such a contentious issue. There's so many kind of diaspora politics you got to play. Obviously Trump is a polarizing figure. So much of what, drew Canadian voters to Mark Carney during the last election was this ability to, or this perception that he would stand up to him. Do you think that this risks, kind of creating a bit of a fracture in terms of how he's perceived by voters?
I don't think it creates a fracture in terms of how voters perceive him or how his voting results will be moving forward. I don't think politically it'll have that sort of issue. But what I think is that this is a very difficult situation. It's a situation that's evolving maybe by the hour consistently. So I don't fully, maybe it's me and maybe I'm crazy, but I don't fully blame the Prime Minister for having a bit of an evolving opinion as the situation continues to evolve, right? So I think the reality is a lot of us know the amount of, uranium and nuclear proprieties that Iran had is a dangerous amount, and the regime that was in Iran and currently still is also dangerous to the people and to the rest of the world. So I can understand how he would be supportive of intervention there, but then I think when you see it play out and you see, for lack of better words, bad things happening to innocent people, of course there's regret, of course there's feelings of empathy, of course there's feelings of pain. I think even Iranian folks here in Canada, and I'm Kurdish, I'm from the Iraq portion, but my family originally comes from the Iran portion, my dad's side. We understand a lot of the pain that is being felt there. We understand that, a lot of folks had to flee from Iran to come here. We understand what's going on. A lot of folks from the Iranian community are supportive of intervention, but I think it's with regret as well. I think they're understanding and they're seeing what's going on as a result. And my family in Kurdistan is very scared because they're worried about what's to come next, right? And I think that uncertainty and what we're seeing is bringing a lot of feelings of pain and a lot of feelings of concern in Canada and around the world. So I can understand how I wouldn't want a prime minister who would just go, no, this is my decision. This is what I thought. This is what I'm going to think it, when it's a massive world event that's currently happening. And we're seeing the repercussions and the implications play out. He needs to take those things into account. And I think he is.
Do you think he should have waited before issuing a statement in the first place? Or do you think it needed to be that kind of sudden, for lack of a better word?
I think a lot of Iranians have waited a very long time for this, so I can understand how people would want a statement very quickly.
What about you, Aya? What do you think about how the Prime Minister handled this? And to Bahoz's point, with the President, and to Brian's point, President Trump, it feels like something happens and then he either doubles down or goes in a completely different direction. called it Doug Ford, but it's tough to predict. What do you think about how he handled the situation?
Well, I didn't understand why he came out with the statement so soon. Like, I know Bahoz says, like, some people have been waiting for a long time for this. Sure. But they could have waited 24 more hours. I feel like, you're kind of, he was kind of among the first world leaders to come out with a statement, and he was so supportive. Like, it wasn't very nuanced for a situation that calls for a lot of nuance. And yeah, I do think your position can evolve, and it should evolve. Like, only crazy people don't change their minds. But that being said, there are some contradictions and some big question marks about, how aligned are you going to be with your ideals of international law? And I can understand, I can respect that he had things to do yesterday, but an appearance at the debate wouldn't have hurt. And what the Bloc Québécois leader said about how, les absents ont toujours tort, like absent people are always wrong. And there's something there. Like, he should have been there to clarify his position. Now, he's going to be at question period today, so we might have an opportunity to hear more about what he's thinking and what Canada's position is as the situation evolves. So by the time that our listeners hear us, we will have more information, hopefully. But at this point in time, I think, the absence and the lack of follow-up and clarification when there's a lot of question marks in the air is probably not a good look.
And I'm just curious to get everyone's take on this, because I think this question of how does this align with what he laid out, that vision from Davos, I feel like there's some people who defend the Prime Minister say, no, this is exactly what you do. Take a pragmatic approach, looking at Canada's best interest Canada's self-interest, and make a decision as a result. And others say, maybe you didn't say it explicitly, but it was pretty clear from the messaging that the whole theme of that speech was, we no longer go along to get along, especially with the U.S., that we're not going to suck up to the Americans. We're going to tell them no when they're wrong. And right now it seems like, the Prime Minister even alluded to it last week. Like, it kind of seems like you guys broke international law. So,
I don't know.
Sorry, I didn't want to make
it Mark, or if they flat out did.
I'm like, it was too cavalier. Like, he was like on his phone responding or something, like, oopsies. But I'm curious, whoever wants to start us off, what are we seeing the Prime Minister already kind of walk back in action what he said at Davos?
But don't you guys think this is actually like it's more like him obviously just trying to not displease Trump as much, even though despite of what he said in the speech, obviously we're still in negotiations with them, like trying to lower the tariffs. The tariffs are looming still. Isn't this like, how much of this is just him trying to, play the game and not really speaking his mind? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like, when it comes to this public statements and public positioning of the country, how much is actually what he thinks and how much is what he has to say because of, like the international scenario and how things are playing out?
It's a good point, but does it not just contradict what he said Davos, being like,
yeah,
hey guys, actually, I got to shut up sometimes because our economy's at stake here.
Yeah. I wonder how much is that the reality, though, actually allows him to do that. Like, how much room he actually has to maneuver here. It's a lot.
Does he have any?
Right?
I think it goes back to the original conversation, Marco. Is there an election this spring? Because you see every time he punches at President Trump, he goes up in the polls in Canada because that's what Canadians are looking for. And this is a sticky situation where there's anybody that has studied or looked at this region for any amount of time, there's 7 presidents have said no to the impending nuclear conflict that was about to come in the next weeks to months from Iran Netanyahu has been talking about since 2012 and earlier. This is a quagmire. It's turning into a regional conflict that has real consequences to Canadians through inflation, through oil prices, through gas prices, real consequences to the Chinese with the oil supply. Are they gonna, as they talked about, as Trump talked about, start unsanctioning Russian oil so that they can, there's real consequences to this. So I think anybody that takes a quick response was always going to be wrong in this, and this is going to continue to unfold. But I think there's also the issue that you're starting to see. It started on the India trip. Maybe Liberal prime ministers just shouldn't go to India, because it started on the India trip with the miscommunication with the reporters that was very well covered, and the prime minister kind of hiding from reporters for a couple of days on the trip because they didn't want to get asked about the foreign interference questions, and just bad comms all the way through that, including the Iran situation. And I think they were hoping to get their feet on the ground back in Canada and be able to create some stability with their comms on this. And to date, they've not been able to.
This is your wheelhouse. What do you think about how the PMO has handled comms around this?
I think that if this was about Canada's relationship with the US, I think the statement would have taken longer, and I don't think that they would have came out so quickly. I think that there would have been that consideration that you folks are talking about polling, right? About how does this make us look? How do we want to align with the United States? But I think the reality is that's not the consideration that's here. The consideration here is like global stability and the context of what's happening in the Middle East and Iran's nuclear abilities. So I think that that's kind of what the considerations are, and I think that that's where Prime Minister Carney's viewpoint came out in full force, and granted, somewhat quick, but I don't think I'm just aligned on that page. Like, I think he came out with his viewpoints, with his convictions quickly, and yeah, people can judge him. He's the prime minister. That's within everyone's right. But my viewpoint on it is that I think if this was like a United States-Canada relationship question, I think that there would have been a lot more consideration in that statement, as opposed to we support an intervention. Right? I think that there would have been more nuance to it, but I think that just isn't the question. I think Prime Minister Carney is a bit different than other folks because I do think he kind of leads with the courage of his convictions, and I think that that's where his policy comes forward and his viewpoints come forward, and we see it in how he kind of runs Parliament Hill and Cabinet a little bit differently than the last guy, who was great when I was there, but it is different. So I think that if the question was around the relationship, I think there would be different aspects that we would be looking for that just aren't there.
I feel like one piece of this equation that we haven't talked about is the oil prices. I find this graphic, but basically, I think Trevor Tombay said that if the price of oil stays where it is for the next, maybe he said 3 to 6 months, it would completely erase Alberta's entire projected deficit this year, even if they fell back below $80 a barrel. You're hearing the Conservatives ramp it up their calls, saying this is exactly why we need to build out infrastructure for energy exports. What do you make of that? Do you think things like this are really going to have wide-scale impacts on how we talk about energy in this country?
I mean, you're already seeing it, and there were predictable reactions from industry and from conservative circles about the need to build out more pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think there is, a bit of a realistic approach from this Liberal government. We heard Minister Hodgson say, phone is ringing, people want LNG, but we're not going to build that out in a few days. And of course, that's always the thing with fossil fuels, right? Like, when prices are so volatile, how do you make these long-term investments that require some kind of stable projection, some kind of risk awareness? And I think we are going to be at this, middle of the road type of moment where we have to decide which way we're going to turn. Are we going to double down on fossil fuel, or are we going to, build out clean electricity grids? Because that's what you're seeing in the UK. That's what you're seeing in other EU countries. They're using this moment as a reason to move away from fossil fuels because, of course, right now it's Qatar, it's the Strait of Hormuz, but who knows what it'll be in 10 years, right? This problem of the volatility that's tied to fossil fuels is going to remain even after this conflict with Iran. This is going to be a very interesting conversation that we're going to have here in our country about where we want to take this. Do we want to double down or do we want to change course completely?
No, it's a good point. And I'm curious if why they're calling, if they know that we can't make a rapid turnaround to get our oil exports. Are they just being like, hey, next conflict that emerges in the Middle East, make sure you guys have your ducks in a row? I guess that part I don't quite understand. Or is that just Tim Hodgson trying to pump our tires here?
I think Tim Hodgson is pumping some tires for sure. And I think the countries that stand to benefit from panic buying right now, it's the US, it's Australia, and Russia. It's not Canada. Canada is still a little fish in a big pond when it comes to LNG. So whether that's used as a justification or whether that helps some of the big projects that we have right now reach a final investment decision, Xela Sims or LNG Canada Phase 2. These are projects that have been in the works for years. We still don't have the companies aren't willing to commit to that expansion because they don't know if Canadian LNG is going to be viable or competitive in 10 years' time. And it's a really hard call to make, especially in a current situation like this where the oil prices are going cray-cray. I don't envy the people who work on hedge funds, or I wouldn't want to be making decisions in this kind of environment because this is just so hard to predict from 1 minute to the next.
But the only thing I'd add, Marco, the government of Alberta's treasury is not the only treasury that's going to get full from oil prices going up. It will be also the federal government and thus other governments around the country that utilize the transfer payment system, right? So at the end of the day, this is the increase in oil prices is good for Canadians through that, but the lack of buying power through inflation is going to be difficult. And we can have an entire podcast on what Aya is talking about. I think it's a great topic of discussion and conversation that needs to be moved forward in Canada for the next several years. But really what Aya is talking about and what I've been talking about deregulating the sector are, I think, the conversation. I think Prime Minister Carney's trying to have it both ways with picking winners and losers through the major projects office is just, I don't believe it'll work. I believe you've got to have a vision, as I is talking about, one way or another.
And actually, hearing Brian talk makes me think about this, because let's say that this is good for Alberta, this is good for the federal treasury as well, and that there's a case here to build out more fossil fuel infrastructure. We know that we're eyeing Asian markets for this fossil fuel infrastructure, right? That's the reason we want to go through the north coast of BC's, because we want faster sailing times to Asia. We want China. This is who we're banking on to buy this stuff 10 years, 15 years down the line. But I wonder if for China, looking at this moment of here we are again, one of our major suppliers, Iran having all this instability, Qatar, and then we also lost Venezuela. How much longer are we going to be held hostage to this industry that is so geopolitically unstable? And, at this moment in time, this is different from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since then, the price of clean tech has gone down so much and the capacity of battery storage has gone up so much. So we're in a completely different moment, and China isn't building out its clean electricity grid out of love for the environment. It's building it because it makes economic sense. And might this be a moment where China is like, okay, well, goodbye to fossil fuels then, because this is just another example of why this is not a reliable source of power.
The only thing I would say is, you're right when you're talking about Asia, but it is also through the Port of Churchill, it is targeting Europe. Right? If they do that, the grid from Churchill to all the way to the West Coast. But you raise a great point when it comes to China. China is trying to already go down that path. This is still a long ways away, right? Their manufacturing is still reliant on the use of fossil fuels and oil. India is another one of the countries that's going to be a major recipient of our products, as you see with the uranium deal that they have with Cameco. But I think this is the actual conversation to be had.
But India, we just went there and we didn't come back with a long-term LNG supply contract either. No one is actually committing to a specific demand into the future. And with China as well, this is a country that constantly undercommits and overdelivers. And so, yeah, of course, they have a long journey ahead of them for electrification, but every year they beat out the predictions that people had for how quickly this would happen. Again, how do you make these long-term investment decisions when you don't actually know the full picture of what it might look like a few years down the road? And this is really creating such an interesting moment for us as a humanity.
No, as a country, as a Canadian country, this is, I think, one of the moments that the country needs to decide which direction it's going. As an investor in clean tech, I can tell you the industry is there's no money going into that sector in this country, right?
Well, we'll see if that changes as we continue to see fluctuations in the price of oil because of this conflict. I did want to close with our last topic on Ontario politics. Barbara alluded to it earlier, that the polls have tightened. We don't necessarily know if we're seeing an outlier, if we're seeing a small kind of dip, or if Doug Ford is starting to lose a bit of that Teflon coating. Barbara, I'll start with you. What's your read on some polling suggesting that the Liberals, even without a leader, even in the fact that their slow-moving leadership race is finally starting, seem to be in striking distance of what seemed to be the most popular premier this time last year?
Yeah, this is interesting because I feel like when you go on for too long, there's just it might even not be him necessarily. It might be just the fact that they're in power for a very long time. And now there's not, the factor that you can really blame on the former Liberal government. You can't you were there for a long time. So you're starting to have sort of ownership for the results of your policies, and voters start to know that, right? They forget about the previous governments and they just, it's on Doug Ford. Education is getting more expensive, or, and even recently he had to take on some unpopular measures. And it's funny because he's usually a very populist premier, right? He likes to pitch himself as someone who focuses on affordability a lot, but we are not actually seeing that in Ontario. We don't see that in our day-to-day lives. And especially now with the OSAP cuts, I understand like he had to do it like mathematically. Just it became like completely unaffordable if he wouldn't have done the changes. I think by 28, 29, the deficits just from this program alone would go up to $4 billion. So it's like it was getting out of control. But on the other hand, you do have all the students, like who were caught in the change, obviously not happy about it. Yeah, this is a long, it might just be like voters getting sick of him. It might be like this newest things that he has been hitting on not being that popular. And on the other side, you also see like the opposition trying to rebuild, right? Like we do have the Ontario Liberals. I mean, they still have a long way to go, but they are starting to get their thing together. They are like, like we do have some strong names coming up. Like people were like excited again, talking to people in the caucus and also like even like insiders, organizers, they are all like very optimistic. They are feeling excited. They're feeling momentum. And it's also just like time-wise, it plays really well for them because people are getting sick of Doug Ford a little bit. So like, yeah, it's like, it feels like it's a very important choice who the next leader is going to be. Like they do have to make a smart choice on that because, yeah, they seem to have building, like if they really do the right choice, they might have a chance. And this is a huge thing because I really wouldn't believe that I would be saying that like a week or two ago. Like, but now it does feel like things are changing for them, while also changing for the PCs on the worst side. Like things are getting worse for the PCs and sort of slightly better for the opposition. I think a lot of things will be also like when the budget actually comes out and we actually see these changes, because even like inside the PC bubble, we are seeing some people like the Project Ontario people, Matt Spoke and this guy just like being not super excited about how Ford handled finances. And he has been very vocal about like building a new Toronto Convention Center and expanding the Billy Bishop Airport. And, like all these things are going to be pricey. So yeah, I'm just excited to see the budget and see how things play out after that. But it feels like a weird and exciting momentum of like both the opposition going up and Doug Ford in the PCs going down, and this sort of like balancing things out together. And I think it's going to be an exciting next election when we have one.
Who's you were on the other side last provincial election. What's your read? Has the ground truly shifted in Ontario?
I mean, I'll say this in the family-friendly way because I can't swear on the podcast. The Ontario Liberals cannot mess this up. It is a very dire moment for them. We can't afford a third failed leadership, a third failed election. It just can't happen, especially without movement. And granted, we did obtain party status in the last election. That's great, but it obviously didn't end up anywhere near what is ideal and what should have been. And I think that's why a lot of people are actually very mobilized and excited again, because I think they're coming to realize that not only is there a genuine opportunity, but without people's participation, without people getting involved, nothing's actually going to change. It's going to be more of the same and more of the same. The same thing happened to slightly different, a bit better again, like, between a 1 and a 2 with Bonnie than it did Stephen, right? So yes, there was improvement, but it wasn't what it should have been. And I think that people, mobilizers, organizers, candidates, everyone's kind of like, this is our opportunity and we really can't afford to mess it up one more time. So I think it's really exciting. I think, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith is exciting. He's getting young people involved. As Barbara was talking a bit about OSAP. He has a lot of young folks on his campaign, a lot of people who are in university. And I think they're actually like, and this blows my mind, they're actually so excited. They're so excited and they believe in this guy. And they, as I was talking about the courage of convictions, but similarly, he has this vision, he has a viewpoint, and I think he's really pushing things forward. I think for the first time, the Ontario Liberal Party is like, okay, we don't need just another, boring person up there who will reiterate the same things that, Ontario Liberals have maybe said 15 years ago. We'll get something different and new and maybe something a bit more brave, something that resonates with people. And I think, to your point about what's going on with Doug Ford, I think government-itis is a very, very real thing. Again, I saw it at the tail end of the Trudeau government where at a certain point, your mechanisms and the way that you facilitate governance and the way that you talk to voters changes and the way that they perceive you changes. And, you have a lot of staff leaving, as Barbara mentioned as well, we have a lot of staff coming and going and a lot of things are starting to shift. So that will have impact on how they proceed. And it's not unique to any one government. Again, we also saw it with Harper. Like it's just the realities of the situation. So it is a bit of a perfect storm right now to have the Ontario Liberals working on something new and exciting and motivating, and then also having Doug Ford kind of slipping through the cracks a little bit.
I mean, I think Bahoz makes a great point too, that even if Doug Ford is vulnerable, that if you don't, it seems like voters are looking for some actual alternative who's going to maybe do something bolder. Is that your read, Brian? Do you think that it's not just Doug Ford necessarily slipping popularity as, he goes on there in years in terms of time in office, that there is a desire for a different path, something that's distinct in Ontario? Or is it just, maybe we're just sick of seeing Doug Ford's face on the TV screens? If you believe this
I
man,
think
if
Mark
you believe this.
getting sick of seeing Doug Ford's face on it.
No, I hope he never loses power, because I want to see those rants. I think it's so, I love not knowing exactly what's going to come out of a politician's mouth.
Marco. Who else eats a bee?
Marco's going to be on his campaign next time.
Oh, absolutely.
It's never boring.
So listen, from my perspective, there's a few things going on, and what does he slip to? 40% in the polls, still a majority government. This is a province that has a history of long reigning governments. What the last PC government before Harris was 40 years ish. Then you had Liberal government for a long time. The federal government seems to affect, to me, the Ontario government so much. At the end of the day, I also think you're having been around those pollster tables and having seen some of the inner mechanisms of campaigns and machinations, there's no disputing that Prime Minister Carney is overwhelmingly having a moment. He is popular right now in all parts of the country. And I think when you hit Liberal or PC on a polling question, there's a lot of Ontarians are like, oh, Mark Carney, great. I don't really see a huge difference. The other aspect I would say is this is the end of the first year of his term, of a majority term. You have Minister Calanger out there pushing some hard messaging. You've got other ministers trying to get some things done that, aren't, they feel they have to get done, but aren't necessarily the most popular things. You've got Minister Downey, the Attorney General, presenting to the Supreme Court for the first time since I can't remember the last time an AG presented to the Supreme Court on an issue as controversial as Bill 20. You got some guys showing some courage of their convictions. I really believe come year 3 and 4, as they get closer to an election, you're going to see a lot more of the polished Doug Ford PC government that you're used to. And then we'll have the Liberal leader and we'll be able to say, okay, we got the NDP, Liberal, and PC. We'll see where it's going. I think right now it's first year of a majority government. I don't think much of it, to be honest with you.
Well, I'm curious, both Brian and Bahoz, because you guys have been in the inside on this. When did you know, or did you know, that the kind of end was near for the leader of the government? I'm just curious, when did you know that Stephen Harper wasn't going to win? Or Bahoz, when did you know Justin Trudeau was like...
You're trying to trigger Brian and me.
Yeah, exactly. He's good at this, though. He's good at this. So I'll go first. I had an exit interview with the Prime Minister because I had decided not to run again because I had family and the travel was becoming too much. And it was summer of 2014. I would say it was around then that I was pretty certain he wasn't going to win government again. I just felt like we were getting tired. I felt like, Bahoz said it, I felt like we had governmentitis. We had kind of reduced the GST from 7 to 6 to 5. We'd done all the things we had initially campaigned on doing. And I felt like we were pushing government bureaucrat policies. And I felt like the guys, what I said to the Prime Minister, and this is probably different for everybody, and this is way too much of a politician's answer. I said to the Prime Minister, and I will tell you, this was a meeting that was supposed to be 15 minutes that he waved Ray off 3 times, because I don't think anybody had told him before. Not sure this is going so well for you. But I said to him, it was around the Nigel Wright stuff. And can have a whole discussion around Nigel's situation. Nigel's was a great human being. The guys in the dressing room around back home don't believe you anymore. And for me, when you started losing them, it was, I just didn't think you were going to be able to recover. We were obviously going to win my riding, but just felt like we were losing some of our core supporters, right? So for me, it was around 2014. Peter had kind of made his decision not to run it again then. James Rajat, you were starting to lose a lot of senior caucus members as well.
But what about you, Bahoz? When was it apparent that Trudeau was kind of a spent force? Was there any decision, or was it, to Brian's point, it was just people were tuning you out and just feel like they didn't believe what you were selling anymore?
It's difficult to say. I think it was death by 1,000 cuts, right? So I think it was continuing on and on. And I think from the COVID election onward, I think that's when you kind of see things to change. If I could pinpoint one moment where I thought, oh, this is it, probably the Toronto St. Paul by-election. And I think a lot of people probably noticed it before. I'm sure I did as well. But, I think that's when any sort of doubt or question in my mind kind of went, okay, like this just isn't going to work. The thing with Justin Trudeau that's different than so many other people and very commendable is he's a fantastic campaigner, right? So he was so good at kind of building things back up and winning people back. And people did, even my mom kind of lost out on him, but when the whole thing with Chrystia Freeland happened, she was so upset by it, and she went like, why would she do that to him? So it's interesting, like the love that people have for him on one level, but then the frustration that people have on another. I think that it was all very convoluted, and there was always a bit of hope because he's just such a great campaigner, and he's so different than other politicians and able to connect with people on such a human level. But I think Toronto St. Paul's was the moment where we went, okay, like this is big, big trouble. And then you saw basically from there an exponential change in events that start to occur. That's when you start to see caucus support fray and a lot of the rumors, and then the rumors ended up, yielding to true impact and true events. And then Sean Casey on TV, and then finally at the end with, the fall economic statement and Minister Freeland. So it was dominoes, but each domino kind of got bigger every single time.
Your mom is a tough judge. Chrystia Freeland got fired, and she still is like, what are you doing, Chrystia?
Well, my mom said, she's like, I don't think I can vote for Trudeau this time. But she also said, so to be clear, my family's from Whitby, Durham region, the 905. My mom said she couldn't vote for Trudeau, but she said, but I can't vote for Pierre either. And I think that that's something that maybe I should have picked up on at the time.
Now,
Well,
would you agree that COVID years were like, I always say they were like dog years. Like it's hard enough in government, but it's
1,000%.
Seems like your leaders out in front of the TV, in front of like every day. There's no mitigating that. Like, do you think that had an extra impact on him?
But by miles. And like, honestly, Brian, is such a good point, because by miles, he's out there every single day talking to people when people are out there most frustrated, they're most scared, they're most uncertain, and the affordability crisis just went rampant through the roof, right? So you're dealing with, honestly, that whole time was very difficult for him. It started with the flight from Iran, and I remember it was January 2020 when that happened, or it was around that time. So it started then, and then it went to COVID, and then it just was one issue after the another. But yeah, COVID really made a difference in, I think, how people perceived him, and I think people were on board initially, but then when divisions start to occur, you start to see fractures in the external face of the government. I think people were really, really not harsh, because that would suggest that they don't have a right to be, but people were judging him in a very different way as they were going through what was probably some of the toughest times of their life.
Yeah, and I would note Doug Ford's the only senior politician left in the country from the COVID years. Like he has reinvented himself so many times, right?
We have the two biggest Doug Ford fans on this podcast, Marco and Brian.
I'm honestly not, though. It's just like that is such a look. I'm with media now, so I'm not biased at all. But at the end of the day, like I'm friends with a lot of provincial cabinet ministers, and I bug them all the time that Doug Ford's far from what I would consider a traditional conservative. I'm a Harper guy, right? But you have to give him props that he has really reinvented himself several times over, from being
absolutely
Rob Ford's kind of whip to being this guy that he is today. He's really reinvented himself. And so to ever predict his demise, I think is a fool's errand, because he might be a SOCON before this is all over.
I agree. And like, listen, he's a great retail politician. Like, people would ask me if I was angry at the loss in the last provincial election. And I'd go, at myself, but not on Ontarians, because they ran a better campaign. They were better communicators, and they were able to connect in a much more authentic and meaningful way. And that was the reality of the situation.
I mean, I think Doug Ford is very good at changing his political stripes when his popularity wanes. So he attaches himself to whatever shooting star there is. And I think that's Mark Carney right now. But, I feel like if the NDP had an unexpected surge in the polls, he'd be out there protesting with the Kiefa on and the, stop the cuts to OSAP or whatever.
Or Blue Jay tickets, or like...
Exactly. Love that. There's a perfect example of the Doug Ford world. These tickets are ridiculous. He's the one who came in power and got rid of that legislation that Kathleen Wynne was going to put in place.
I can't even talk about tickets. I can't get tickets to NoahCon, and I'm so upset. And I'm blaming Doug Ford. I want you to know that. So
At least Maple Leaf tickets, I assume, are through the floor right now. I don't know. Maybe they're still $200, $300 even to see a terrible team in action.
Photo
I know
radar,
you're like,
Marco.
okay, back.
I'll trigger Marco Bahoz. Photo radar. How about that one?
Yeah.
I mean, that's why he's in the job and I'm not. You put in the legislation to put it in place, and then you're like, people are, come on, this is ridiculous. What a cash grab. And you get rid of it. I love it. No one can do it like
the way
him.
they do it.
I don't even think Mark Carney could pull that off, honestly. But we're kind of running a bit late on time, so I'll get to our final segments. But this is just when we let everyone talk about something that they're either looking forward to in the week ahead, or something that maybe caught their attention last week, but maybe didn't get the broad kind of public attention that it should have. I'll start with you, Bahu, since you're our special guest. What are you looking forward to this week, or is there something maybe you want to flake from this past week?
I'm looking forward to the by-elections. We talked about it, but I really have to double down on that. And then I'll get into a provincial one too. I am a federal and a provincial liberal, so bear with me. But I'm looking forward to the by-election and how they play out. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where people put their resources. I have a hunch, and I think we all know that the federal liberals are going to put all their resources into Terrebonne. We saw Marjorie Michel there the day before the election was called, and we're seeing staff go there as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out and how the story and the narrative there unfolds. So I'm definitely taking a close eye on that. Provincially, of course, I'm talking about the leadership. I really need to know how that works out too. We're seeing very excitingly, Nathaniel Erickson-Smith put up his hand to run the nomination for Scarborough Southwest, took the first opportunity he could to showcase that he's not only a team player, but he's willing to take risks. I want to see how that works. I want to see how the nomination unfolds. I want the rules. I want them to move this along, and I want to see how this impacts the party, how this impacts the leadership, and I think how it impacts the general election, which can come whenever, because Doug Ford just snaps his fingers and calls an election. So could be tomorrow.
Absolutely. Barbara, what about you? What are you looking forward to?
Yeah, that's totally fair. Like, I totally keeping an eye for the by-elections as well. And the Ontario Liberals are being just super exciting at the moment. So I'm also having an eye on them. But maybe not necessarily for next week, but but obviously the budget, I think everyone wants to know. They also hinted some sort of tax reform might be in the budget. So I don't know like how radical this will be. Probably not that much, but it's still super interesting to follow. And yeah, again, not for next week, but I'm also keeping an eye on Doug Downey at the Supreme Court, because he's going to be talking about the notwithstanding clause, and just super interesting that he's doing that. So obviously keeping an eye on that as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Barbara. It's very rare for a provincial attorney general to argue in front of the Supreme Court. Brian, what about you? What are you looking forward to, or something you want to flag from the past week?
Well, I guess two things. One, Barbara got ahead of me on it, but I do think it's really interesting to see the Attorney General of Ontario actually in front of the Supreme Court arguing on Bill 21 and the notwithstanding clauses is really putting the government's position out there. And I give Doug Downey all the credit in the world. He's shown some real cahoots here. Because if this goes badly, you saw with Flaherty, it can be a bit of a shot across the bow. But to have the courage of his convictions to go do this himself, I think is impressive. Yeah, I'm not watching the by-elections as much as I am shocked and amazed at the polling in Alberta. I have done some digging into that, and it really seems like the sovereignty play and the people playing around with the sovereignty aspect has come back to bite them. I find Aya's comments really interesting in Quebec, because it just seems like the people that are saying, I want to stay in Canada, are like connecting themselves to the Liberal Party and Mark Carney on this. And it seems to really have backfired on people that have maybe not been definitive enough on the sovereignty piece. So I find that really interesting. And I don't see how any politician can have if those numbers are sustained for the next month or two, I would be shocked if we're not in an election.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Brian. It seems like that situation in Alberta is like, it seems like it's turning Jason Kenney into a moderate or a liberal just based on the fact that someone's arguing in defense of Canada. Wild times. How about you?
Something I'm keeping an eye out on, and we haven't seen a lot of reporting on this, but the Major Projects Office, they have an Indigenous Advisory Council, and that was created sort of after the backlash against the Building Canada Act, and it was a way to ensure that Indigenous input would be considered in Major Projects Office work. And I asked recently for the Private Council Office to see the terms of reference for the Indigenous Advisory Council. And I've been told they're not finalized yet. And I find that really interesting, because these people have been appointed for 6 months now. They've met a couple times. It should be pretty straightforward to have that first step of determining what's the role, what are the responsibilities, and what's the authority of the Indigenous Advisory Council within the Major Projects Office. And the fact that we don't have one yet, I think is interesting. I've been trying to get some information about, are there some disagreements among the council members? And I'll let you guys know what I find out, but this is definitely something that's standing out to me, especially as, we get closer to July, which is when Alberta is going to submit its proposal for a new Northwest Coast pipeline to BC. And it's probably where we're going to actually see some of that national interest designation controversy ramp up and some opposition from First Nations. And it's probably where we're going to see some disagreement with the Indigenous Advisory Council.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. You shouldn't say no one's reporting on it because you're reporting on it and you're doing a terrific job helping our major project.
I might say, like, the Major Projects Office, so I haven't seen them do a single media interview since September. It's not just me, and it's not CBC, it's not Globe and Mail. Like, they have a new media policy, whether officially or not. And I've been told kind of off the record that, they have bigger fish to fry. But yeah, I feel like if we're going to be paying millions of taxpayer dollars, then media as a fish, you should be fine.
I don't disagree with that. The thing I'm looking forward to this week is seeing how this whole dispute over C9 looks like it will die a quiet death. The Liberals put forward a motion to speed up debate on it. They voted, I think, earlier today to end debate on that motion. So I assume the Conservatives will put forward another filibuster at committee as it goes through clause by clause. But C9, the anti-hate bill, got a lot of attention because of this Bloc Québécois exemption, removing the religious beliefs exemption from hate speech law. But it seems to have kind of flatlined a bit. And I think the big question now is, if the Conservatives were open to playing ball with this Bloc amendment being on the table. But I do think, if the Liberals have this overwhelming advantage in the polls, even if you don't go to an election, how much kind of sail in your wind does it put when you are having these conversations about contentious pieces of legislation, especially if the Prime Minister is so personally popular? You kind of dare the opposition parties, like, you want to fight on this? This is your pet issue. We can beat you over the head. We are not afraid to go to an election. I think, Brian, you have that experience in the Harper government where you didn't need to negotiate. You could just say, we're going to do this. And if you don't want to get on this train, well, you're going to get run over it. So I'm very curious to see that. Also, I'm just very curious to see what is left on this government's to-do list right now. It seems like it's getting thinner by the day, which I think is helping to, stoke that discussion around an election. Like, we're going to have our budget implementation bill passed very soon. C4 would likely get passed by the House shortly as it comes back from the Senate. Some of these crime bills will probably progress pretty quickly. And then it's like, well, what else are you proposing? What else is super, super pressing that, can't wait for an election? So very curious to see how that happens, and if they're hoping to clear the deck before calling fall elections. That's what I'll be watching for. But yeah, thanks everyone for keeping with us, and thanks for our wonderful guests for showing up with us. And Brian, thanks of course for manning the co-host duties with me. This has been No Talking Points. We will see you back here next week.
It's Marco. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.